B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, January 4th, 2019. Your humble host is often a little too humble, doesn't toot his own horn, doesn't brag about what he's up to. So today we're tossing out all of those self-imposed restrictions for a little personal promotion. Your humble host published an op-ed today in the San Jose Mercury News. And it's something that I feel very strongly about. And I'm linking to the commentary. You can read it for yourself. It relates to recent moves by the California State Supreme Court. They overruled outgoing Governor Jerry Brown in 10 cases. One, a pardon of a former convict, and the other 9 cases were individuals who are currently incarcerated, and Brown didn't order them released. He simply reduced their sentences. And, curiously, this past March, when the Supreme Court was shy one member, the sitting 6 justices issued an unusual order, and it clarified their interpretation of the state constitution, which does give them the power to intervene and block the clemency authority of a governor. Now, I think this is unwise, and if I could, I would amend the California Constitution to change that. But as it stands, the court has not used this power at all in over 50 years. The last time, Jerry Brown's father was subject to a little bit of intrusion from the Supreme Court on a controversial pardon that he issued. And so the court, in the March order, said, it's not our job to intervene on the merits of a case. We simply have to uphold a standard that the governor has not abused his power in granting clemency. So this becomes a head-scratcher. The court appeared to anticipate a flood of clemency from Governor Brown before he left office, and he didn't disappoint. Hundreds of people, mostly those who served their time long ago, had convictions expunged or other acts of clemency. But the most disturbing case is the case of a man named Bori I. Last name is spelled A-I. And he was paroled from the California system in 2016. He is ethnically Cambodian, but he never lived in that country. His parents gave birth to him in Thailand after they fled the American War in Cambodia in the 1970s. And Bori I wound up in Stockton, California. He was at the grade school where there was that ugly shooting spree that occurred back, I believe it was about 1995. At any rate, Bori I was a participant in a robbery. And he was convicted of murder in that case, and he served his time. And Governor Brown took his power to wipe the slate clean for Bori I. And the court overturned the governor's decision. And the practical impact of that is that the court decided that Bori I will be subject to likely mandatory deportation to Cambodia. Now, in the other 9 cases, it is hard to imagine that the governor abused his authority. In one case, he reduced a man's sentence from 45 to life to 25 to life. That's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. And so I am demanding that the court explain itself, that it must be fully transparent in these cases. They have to articulate clear standards to the public, to the new governor, Gavin Newsom, and to those who petition for clemency. And I believe they must explain exactly why the governor was considered abusing his power, requiring their intervention, and essentially deciding in favor of Bori I's deportation. So I encourage you to read my piece. Obviously, I agree with it. And you are free to agree or disagree with me. Use my email, peter@peterbcollins.com. And I note on the issue of deportation of those of Cambodian background, well, federal immigration authorities were barred by a court order yesterday to use any more unannounced raids on Cambodian immigrants with deportation orders. Deportations from the U.S. to Cambodia increased 279% in 2018. Judge Cormac Carney in Los Angeles issued a temporary injunction prohibiting ICE from conducting raids and instead ordering the government to give a 14-day written notice before detaining a Cambodian national with a deportation order. And in the case of Bori I, Cambodia has refused to accept him, which makes him a man without a country and a victim of what I consider to be retribution from the California State Supreme Court. Now, while we're on the opinion pages, I want to note a couple of commentaries published today. One, the lead editorial in the New York Times is such a refreshing change. They are embracing reform of abortion laws in order to expand access and to eliminate a loophole in New York State that is detailed in the case of a woman from Brooklyn named Erica Christensen. She was told that her baby would be born and immediately strangled. And so she sought an abortion, but she was already 30 weeks pregnant, and she didn't qualify for an exception for a woman's life in danger. So she and her husband had to pay $11,000 to go all the way to Colorado to get the abortion that they sought. And the new Reproductive Health Act in New York State would permit nurse practitioners, physician assistants, midwives to provide non-surgical abortion care. It would remove the abortion law from the state's penal code, put it in the health code, and a number of other minor changes. And I just consider this to be important because the Democratic Party, I think, based on polls, has largely gone silent on abortion rights and are allowing the right wing to drive that agenda with more and more of these pretextual laws that are clearly unconstitutional, like the fetal heartbeat law that's been ping-ponged back and forth between the former governor of Ohio now, John Kasich, and his Republican-controlled legislature. Also on the opinion page at the Times today, Paul Krugman. And I have not mentioned Paul Krugman in a long time. I lost interest in him when he became just a shill for Hillary Clinton in 2016. But today, he sides with the progressives in the House who are challenging Speaker Pelosi and her determination to include the pay-as-you-go rule to try to provide a path to deficit reduction. And I think Krugman does a great job explaining this here. He writes, some progressive Democrats object to one of her initial moves, and on the economics and probably the politics, her critics are right. The issue is pay-go. He said deficit obsession was deeply destructive in the years that followed the global financial crisis, helping conservatives push for austerity measures that held back economic recovery for years. Furthermore, there are things the government should be spending money on, especially when interest rates are so low. And he goes on to say, when in power, Democrats make big efforts to balance the budget. When Republicans come in, they promptly blow the money on tax cuts for the wealthy. Yet polling consistently shows Republicans with an edge on the question of which party is better at dealing with the deficits. And then he asks, do voters care? And he answers, nah. And finally, I was struck by this opinion piece at the New York Times today, signed by Jonathan Weissman, who is the deputy Washington editor of the New York Times. And I don't always assume that a surname that could be Jewish means that this individual has defined views simply based on that. The headline reads, American Jews and Israeli Jews are headed for a messy breakup. He calls it a schism. And I think that this is really clear thinking and analysis on Weissman's part. He writes, the events of the past year brought American and Israeli Jews ever closer to a breaking point. He said that with the move of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and then the murder of 11 Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, he said that this has helped create bookends of sorts for this struggle that is underway. He says the Israeli Jews see Trump as a man who recognizes their existential threats in scuttling the Obama-era Iran nuclear deal, which many Israelis saw as imperiling their security. They see a president of the United States acting to save their lives. But he writes, American Jews, in contrast, see President Trump as their existential threat, a leader who they believe has stoked nationalist bigotry, stirred anti-Semitism, and time again failed to renounce the violent hatred swirling around his political movement. 75% of American Jews voted for Democrats in the midterm elections. 69% of Israelis have a positive view of the United States under Trump. And that does define what some people call a split and other people call a canyon. And with Netanyahu calling early elections, he notes that in 2015, Bibi darkly warned his supporters, the right-wing government is in danger, Arab voters are heading to the polling stations in droves. Yes, he played the race card. And I think this is a really, really interesting read, and I hope you'll follow the link in the show file at peterbcollins.com and take a look. Meanwhile, the battle in Washington continues. There was another meeting in the White House Situation Room with Trump and the top congressional leaders today. But the Democrats are dug in, and they are not planning to, at least at this point, give another dollar for Trump's wall. And if you listen to yesterday's podcast, I chided the Democrats for failing to bring up two key things about Trump. One is that he lies repeatedly and incessantly, particularly about the issues related to the wall, and he exaggerates the crisis that requires this draconian move. And secondly, I chided the Democrats for not raising moral issues. That Trump's call for a border wall, his demonization of migrants, today it was about how they come in with diseases, and therefore, like vermin, we must lock them out. Well, Pelosi addressed that, and yesterday she made some comments where she said that this is an immoral proposal, the wall. Now, I'm not suggesting that Pelosi or her staff are listening eagerly to the Peter B. Collins podcast every day, but I do hope they pick up on my idea to call out the lies, because I think that is really important. And after the meeting today, Chuck Schumer said that the president is threatening to keep the government closed for a very long period of time, months or even years. And so far, the Democrats have not submitted to the extortion that's being offered. Republicans, like the inarticulate Kevin McCarthy, who's the new minority leader in the House, he's trying to put forth an extortion deal to trade DACA, relief for dreamers, with funding for the wall. And Democrats have at moments tended to agree with that in the past. I hope they will continue to reject hostage-taking of any kind, including those who are affected by the government shutdown. And by the way, it hits home for me. I talked to my brother Dan the other day. He works for Housing and Urban Development. He is a senior manager in the Midwest, and he spent his holidays closing down offices and dealing with issues that were too urgent to be deferred until after the government shutdown, and he doesn't know when or if he will next get a paycheck. And we are seeing some Republicans call for a continuing resolution to end the shutdown. Cory Gardner of Colorado, Susan Collins of Maine, they say they're willing to vote for the measure that was before them at the end of December, and their leadership is refusing to allow that. Mitch McConnell says that he'll only allow a bill to be considered that he knows Trump will sign. Now today, the Democrats unveiled an ambitious agenda that they know is going nowhere. It's called the For the People Act, and it includes a lot of things that I really like. They want to rewrite the Voting Rights Act. They want to stop gerrymandering. They want to put some limits on foreign corporate contributions. They shouldn't be legal at all. I don't think they currently are, but they want to enforce that more. 600 pages. It's a compendium of liberal proposals. And they know that it has zero chance of passing in the Republican-controlled Senate. But it does lay out an important agenda for Democrats, and to that extent, I think it's worthwhile. They want to write a bill that would effectively outlaw the gerrymandering of congressional districts. They want to, mandate that state election officials automatically register eligible citizens to vote. The legislation would ban contributions by corporations substantially owned or controlled by foreigners, would require dark money super PACs to disclose donors of more than $10,000, and there are other bells and whistles here, including disclosure of presidential candidates and presidents' tax returns. So it's a lovely laundry list, and as we know, it is just that. Well, here's the quote from Pelosi: "A wall is an immorality between countries." And she said, "We're not doing a wall." There is a lot of pushback and selective outrage because an incoming congresswoman, she was just sworn in yesterday, Rashida Tlaib of Detroit, a Palestinian-American woman, she told a Move On rally about a conversation she had with her son, who said, "Mama, look, you won. Bullies don't win." And I said, "Baby, they don't, because we're going to go in and impeach the motherfucker." Well, she has tweeted unapologetically that she is going to speak truth to power and tell it like it is. And she said, "This is not just about Trump. This is about all of us. In the face of this constitutional crisis, we must rise." Now, clearly, her language will be picked upon, but, you know, it's so, that's why I use the term selective outrage. Trump can get away with all kinds of language issues. He calls people names. He said that Hillary got schlonged. I mean, he can be rude and crude, and he can get away with the Access Hollywood tape, grab him by the pussy. But when honest outrage is expressed in strong language by a woman, and a Palestinian-American woman, well, you can expect the right wing to go agog. Very unusual piece at Consortium News today that I want to recommend to you. It's written by a man I've never heard of before. He's described as a Republican state senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Dick Black. And it's remarkable because he supports Trump's tweet from December that the U.S. should withdraw from Syria. And he believes that Lindsey Graham and others have gotten to Trump and forced him or persuaded him to slow walk his exit strategy from Syria. And Senator Black writes, "The mainstream media refuses to acknowledge that the hardest fighting against the Islamic State and al-Qaeda has been done by Syria and its allies. Indeed, we label Iran's fight against Syrian terrorists as malign activity, ignoring the fact that al-Qaeda in Syria is the progeny of al-Qaeda that is our arch enemy." And he says that Seymour Hersh wrote that a Defense Intelligence Agency review in 2013 of Syrian policy revealed that clandestine CIA program Timber Sycamore had degenerated into a program that armed all terrorists indiscriminately. And he writes, "I seriously doubt this was a program failure. There's strong evidence that the U.S. planned to overthrow Syria as early as 2001, and that our focus has consistently been on toppling the duly elected constitutional government of Syria." And he notes that he never saw evidence that Syria beheaded people like those who were supported by the U.S. and other supporters of proxies in Syria. And he says the disastrous war would never have occurred without American planning and execution. He says it's instructive that despite Trump's strong directive on a rapid Syrian pullout, apparently not one soldier or Marine has departed Syria. And he noted that there are some 800 of them at a base called Al-Tanf, which is on the border with Jordan. And he said, they could move those 800 troops within 24 hours if they wanted to. And the failure to do so suggests duplicity by our foreign policy shadow government. Meanwhile, The Intercept reports that despite the claim that we're withdrawing from Syria, that air raids have continued and actually increased in intensity over the last couple of weeks. Today I'm releasing an in-depth interview with Bryant Welch, a psychologist who's published an updated version of a book called State of Confusion. And he uses psychological analysis to try to explain the way Americans have been gaslighted. And Bryant Welch is a fan of the 1944 film called Gaslight. We even play a little clip from it in the in-depth interview. And he believes that Americans have been gaslighted and that we are damaged. We are injured psychologically. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with psychologist Bryant Welch. But his base is unmoved. They like being gaslighted, Bryant.
Yeah, yes, they do. And what Donald Trump creates for them is a very reassuring experience inside them that I try to describe in the book. And it's that experience that we're doing battle with here. Now, as I've said, Donald Trump is really a symptom of the problem of the American mind, and it's been growing for several decades now. The mind, the human mind, first and foremost, has to create our sense of reality. Now, most of us think that reality is just out there for us to determine what it is. We look at it, and that's reality. But it's not that way. The sensory bombardment that comes to our mind is unbelievable. It's incredibly complex. The human mind, each individual mind in its own idiosyncratic way, takes that material and organizes it into our sense of reality. Mm-hmm. If we have a hard time organizing it, we get very uncomfortable and very anxious. So when things get complex, or when the mind has been taxed and assaulted in a variety of ways, as I describe in the book, then someone else comes in and says, let me tell you what's real. Let me explain it to you.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with psychologist Bryant Welch. I'm releasing it to subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spreaker. And it's all made possible by people like you who support my work here at the PBC podcast. People like Jerry in Southeast Portland. The original Siri, take that, Apple. Siri Walgren lives in far northern California. Abby McMillan all the way on the coast of Maine. And George Reeves, our own Superman, who just renewed his annual $50 subscription. I invite you to join those ranks. Come on over to peterbcollins.com, find the menu tab, click on it. Click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and you can take care of business in less than 2 minutes. Choose a PayPal subscription level that fits your budget and your intention, and you'll be all set. You'll have early access to our in-depth interviews. That's the benefit you get from subscribing. And, of course, it supports my work and validates what I do here. So, please, come on over and set up a new subscription today. I would appreciate it very much. A good way to start off the new year. Well, one of the things I talked about with Bryant Welch, one of his theories is that what he calls the real battleground states are envy, fear, and what he calls a kind of sexual disturbances. And we then go into a little bit of a sidebar about Trump using transgender people's service in the military as a way to signal to his base that, there's something dark and ugly and weird about that. Well, the U.S. Court of Appeal for the D.C. Circuit has become the first to lend any credence to Trump's efforts to ban transgender persons from serving in the military. In a decision released today, the 3-judge panel found that the lower court judge who had blocked the administration from enforcing the ban made an erroneous finding when she ruled that the plan was the equivalent of a blanket ban on transgender service. Now, I think this is a suspect reading of the law and the issues before the court, and clearly it is an invitation for the Supreme Court to take up this matter, and that's what Trump has been stumping for quite a while. Kevin Gostola is a bright young journalist who operates at shadowproof.com, and his latest piece, I think, is a worthy read. He talks about how Democratic establishment personalities have been attacking journalists who write honestly about Beto O'Rourke, about Elizabeth Warren, or even, well, they don't extend that coverage to Bernie Sanders. And the latest is that David Brock, the guy who I've known for years, he was an opponent of the Clintons, paid to take them down when Bill was president. Then he had his cathartic change and became a huge Clinton supporter with Media Matters and his dark money super PAC during 2016 called Correct the Record. And all these people attacked David Sirota, who I believe is an honest journalist who has dug into Beto O'Rourke's record and reported what he found. And when he was a young guy just out of college, David Sirota worked briefly for Bernie Sanders. And that is enough to tag him for the rest of his life. They always dig that up, that he is an ally of Sanders and, I guess, incapable of honest reporting. But I think it's a good piece that Gostola has written here, and I hope you'll find the time to check it out. Paul Whelan. Every time I bring up his name, the plot thickens and the story twists. He is the guy from the Detroit suburbs, currently locked up in the notorious prison in Moscow, accused of being a spy. The details came out yesterday. Russia says he took a memory stick with confidential information about Russians from a guy in a hotel in Moscow. Yesterday, we learned that Whelan got a dishonorable discharge for, larceny and other problems when he left the Marine Corps. Well, today, the revelation is that Paul Whelan not only has an American passport, he has a British passport, he has an Irish passport, and he has a Canadian passport. Now, as far as we know, they're all under his given name, and so they may not be spy-based passports. The Canadian one is understandable because he was born in Canada and then moved to the United States. We're not sure about the British and Irish grants of passports. At any rate, we know he's been traveling in Russia since 2006, and the headline on today's New York Times is fair. It says, "Is Russia-loving ex-Marine a spy or a pawn?" And once again, I've heard the hawks in alleged liberal media in this country immediately seize on this and say he is a hostage and this is being set up to trade him for Maria Butina. But if you dig deeply, Mueller's already taken the plea from Butina, and when he's finished with her cooperation, she is going to be deported to Russia. And so, would Putin need to take a hostage to set up a trade for Butina? Well, we'll wait and see. But at this point, my suspicion is that Paul Whelan is a spook of some sort. Now, on the public television news hour last night, they trotted out a former CIA guy, John Cipher, and he said, we'd never leave a real intelligence officer vulnerable to arrest. And maybe that's true. But I do believe they protest a bit too much and a bit too early in this unraveling story. I've been keeping one eye on the El Chapo trial in New York. It's not much of a cliffhanger. I think we know he will be convicted and he'll spend the rest of his life in a supermax federal prison. But the testimony got interesting yesterday when a guy who was locked up 5 or so years ago, the guy's name is Vicente Zambada Niebla, and this Zambada is the son of the current leader of the Sinaloa cartel. And he testified for 5 hours about nearly every aspect of drug trafficking, smuggling routes, money laundering schemes, bloody wars, personal vendettas, and multi-million dollars in bribes. And he claims that he knew that his daddy was paying bribes to the security guard for the former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox. And so we know that the cartel was very successful in corrupting every level of government in Mexico and in some other countries as well. So I really don't know when this is all over if it'll make any difference. We shall wait and we'll see. A couple of current Wells Fargo employees are telling the Guardian newspaper based in London that the problems that were exposed With employees being bonused and incentivized to open new accounts at all costs, leading them to open millions of fake accounts for existing customers. And this, of course, has led to $1.7 billion in fines for Wells Fargo, and some of its executives have been fired. But mostly it's the lower-level people who've paid the price. And two sources who still work there say workers are still under intense pressure from middle management to get their bonuses. Compensation has been lost from the reduction of those incentives has not been replaced, and that morale sucks. And you can imagine that. Finally today, Jerome Powell, who has been getting a Twitter attack a day almost from the president. He is chair of the Federal Reserve, if his name doesn't ring a bell for you. He today was in Atlanta, where he submitted to a public interview, and he said the economy is in pretty good shape and that they're watching for any trouble spots and that, blah, blah, blah. Then when he was asked if he would resign if Trump asked him to, Powell simply said no. And as a result, the market, which has been dropping through the floor on a daily basis for the last couple of weeks, shot up by about 3.5%. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.